All right, Susan, go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, to coming to this end of the day. My name is Susan Clark, and I'm teaching in Metro North. And how I got here is that I taught high school students for 34 years in Lakeville until June of 2019. And then we had the big adventure where we turned our life upside down and moved to Washington, D.C. for 2 years, right in time for COVID. And we returned to Minnesota in the summer of 2021. And I realized I have more in the tank and I really missed teaching. So I started teaching in a pilot program with Metro North in August. And it's a program that does subject specific GED prep. And I am the science part of this pilot project. It's virtually. I had coached debate virtually in the past, but I had not taught virtually, and teaching adults was new to me. So in my 6 months of doing this, I've confirmed 4 things that I think are true, at least for my teaching. The person doing the talking seems to be the person who's doing the most learning. So there are moments where I'm learning a lot, but I try to transfer as much of that as I can to the students, to the adults that I'm teaching. I've learned my students are so internationally experienced or culturally experienced in ways that are new to each other and to me, that the more chances I can give them to relate science to their own cultures and life has, and I have a few examples of that coming up, has been surprisingly really meaningful. Just like high school students, it seems to me that adults succeed when we switch activities in this online 2-hour class in the evening after they've worked and have so many other pressures going on. If we switch activities every 10 to 15 minutes. So I tried to do that. And I've learned that adults are just as similar to high school students in that they're willing to try and practice anything I say, hey, let's try this. Sometimes it's a bust, often it works, but that they do like an expected pattern of class. So over my 6 months, I've developed this template that I plot things into. And my goal here in the 45 minutes we have is to give you as many examples as I've stumbled upon that seem to be working, in hopes that every person attending could get one seed of an idea that you could adapt to your own teaching style and your own content and your own kind of students. So I think I packed it with more examples than can really be given justice to dive into, but hoping that not, and I don't like to go to in-service if I feel overwhelmed with ideas, but I like to go if I get a couple good ideas. So I'm erring on the side of knowing that you can go back and look at anything that seems like it went by too fast. So that's the goal. So I've divided the ideas I've had into 6 categories. So I've been experimenting with using Jamboard in Google Meet, which is the platform we use for teaching class, but I think other virtual like Zoom has something really similar. Integrating science news, using the New York Times graphs. I have everyone pick up when they register a little old-fashioned whiteboard and some markers, and I have had a lot of success. So I wanted to share some ideas with you, just doing old-fashioned kind of learning, writing on these little whiteboards and holding it up to the camera, how we use the distance learning in the actual class, and then the parts of math that are on the science test, bringing those in. So we'll start with a few things I've stumbled upon in Jamboard, which was brand new to me as an idea to use. And at first I was a little not confident in myself, but I have gotten to be discovered things that make this a lot of fun and I think successful to use. So one thing is that in Jamboard, you can put pictures in and you can make them as big or as small as you want. So here's an example of a class slide of dragging the photos on top of terms that we had studied about relationships between species, about symbiotic relations. And then here's what it looked like after they dragged the pictures into the right place. And then I have a student, if you see the scribbles, who I don't know exactly, because I asked what his screen looks like, but he can't ever drag anything, but he can draw lines. So when the scribbles on there where he was drawing a couple, trying to draw it, so that's what happened, but they got them in the right spots. Another thing with Jamboard is creating sticky notes that I created and then having them go one at a time to pick one of the facts. So this is about Newton's laws of motion. And Is it an accurate or an inaccurate statement? And when we did this was actually just this week that we did this, and then I took a screenshot of it. They got all but one of them in the right place, and it went fast. It was just, I had to call on them one at a time or the screen looks confusing, but I think we did it in less than 90 seconds. And so an active way to engage people. This is an example from an IXL problem about the scientific method. So the science test I've learned always has questions about scientific method that includes being able to put steps of an experiment in order. So just giving them access to the screen and having them draw the lines for each part of the experiment, which part went with which. And then this is one, so we also do some interpreting of the New York Times graph once a week. And so I tried this, and I thought this would be the first thing I could have you try in the chat. There was a question. So New York Times had a graph, which I'm about to show you, that shows how people around the world answer this question. And I had my students write in Jamboard. So I imported this picture, and then I had them write on it, ranking these, what's the most important factor in determining success. So for here, I've numbered them, and I was thinking if you ask yourself how you would answer this question, and then just type in the chat 1, 2, 3, or 4, and then you'll be able to compare your answer to the international results that were on the graph. And I only have one screen, so I'm not looking at the chat. So I think Amber will tell me what the consensus is, if there is one.
I'm watching. We have some people who are entering their very most important. We've got some really interesting rankings coming in, which I love.
Oh, some people are doing like 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, they're ranking
that's what
most important to least
yeah,
important.
either way.
Oh, and okay. So one of the things I'm noticing right now is we have a really good chunk of 3s and 4s. We've got a couple 2s and not any 1s.
Really? Okay. So when I didn't screenshot my class, and my class has, I think a plus right now is it has anywhere, as people come and go, from 5 to 10 students. So I had them rank just writing on the chart, and it looks something like this. And then here's the graph. So before we even saw the New York Times graph, and the reason this is science, or that I've started to do this, is I've realized the science test is so much about not only reading, but interpreting graphs and charts and being able to read those. And so the more we practice with those, it seems like the better their skills get. And I can tell them really improving of look at the title and figure out what, so it's working. But they thought this was really interesting that in the United States, people are pretty split, but the most common answer, I think, is, well, hard work and family, and not so much education. And then in places like Peru and India, education is really high. Indonesia, overwhelmingly hard work. So just an example of how to engage people with a graph beyond just looking at the graph. Another Jamboard idea was I made a game where some of the words in math and in symbiotic relationships that we've been working with. And so these were the directions. And then they, as a class, had to drag a green and a yellow until they got everything matching. And if you saw someone who you didn't agree with where they put it, you could drag it into a different place. And so they got it. And when this is a screenshot of what theirs looked like when it was finished, and they did have everything in the right place. And I remember a student saying, but I only got to move 5 of them, but then there's only like 14. So you did more than your share, and that was fair. And then I think everybody moved at least 1, and a few moved other people's from the wrong place to the right place. So I will definitely try this again. Another thing on Jamboard is that you can circle, you can write on it, you can highlight on it. So these are 3 paragraphs from a practice problem that was pretty complicated about molecular genetics. And the first thing I asked was to circle words that you might want a definition of or think other people might want a definition of. Now, we had already read each of these paragraphs on a separate screen and studied it a little bit, but then I put them all together. And I wasn't surprised that they circled, like several people circled schizophrenia. I was surprised that someone circled extent. So just before doing anything else to it, we were able to talk about some of the vocabulary that they had already read, and been potentially expected to do a multiple choice practice problem about. And then all of the underlining is asking if you were to pick the line sentence that you thought was the heart of what these paragraphs are about, what would you pick? So I'm only here as an example that Jamboard lets you let your class write all over something. It lets you draw. So Punnett Squares, a big concept on the science test. And then I didn't have a screenshot of their squares, but it was a mess of things that look like this. Drawing lines to match vocabulary, where everyone can be drawing at once. You can erase other people's lines. So that was quick, but a way to do it that was engaging. This was one where one of the science news stories, which is a topic I have coming up, how I've been incorporating science news, was about the sun. It was about taking pictures of the sun and some developments with that. So we had studied Earth and space science a few weeks before. And so before we looked at the news story, I asked everyone to just type on a Jamboard sticky note something that they remembered about the sun. And they remembered so much more than I would have anticipated just off the top of their head from a few weeks before, but it set up, so it was accessing previous learning and then making a connection to something in the news. And it only takes a few minutes of class, but it makes it engaging, and it's why I like this Jamboard operation. And then this is one just from last night. So the New York Times graph this week, did we use this with? Oh yeah, okay. So the New York Times graph this week is about decreasing population in the United States. And it shows the last 10 years. And then you can see the yellow line shows that in 2021, for the first time, natural increase fell below immigration rate. And so the first thing was to take a look at the graph and figure out what it's saying. And I asked a couple open-ended questions, but then I had everyone on a Jamboard sticky note make a prediction about why the US population might be declining in the last 10 years, especially in the last couple years. And I gave them kind of a ridiculous example of a science in the news story about these biting spiders, but for the format. And so then this is what they wrote. And what was interesting about this, and then you can see the person who can't figure out how to use the sticky notes was trying to write his out, but everybody else managed to get an idea on here. And then they were right. So they were able, here's the answer. Fertility decline, people having less children, and less international immigration. Every single answer is one of those two. No one said the third one, that is life expectancy has gone up. Now the death rate is catching up to it, but they got the first two. And I think that made it stick. Okay, so that's my first idea, or my first set of ideas. And then we have my second set of ideas are that it happened to me by accident where I saw something in the news that I thought, hey, this is straight out of our class. I'm going to make a couple slides about this for tonight. And then it was interesting. And so now every class at the beginning, the first thing we do is take something that's happened in the news and do something with it in class. And it is, there have been a couple classes where, because of all kinds of things happening, I've only had one or two students. And then I'll say, well, since just a couple of you are here, what do you want to do first? What do you want to spend the time on? And they always pick the science news. They like it. And then it seems to me to relate to giving context to science, because the more science you know, the better you'll do on the multiple choice kind of GED questions, even though you don't need to have a whole bunch of things memorized. So here's some examples with how I've used it. Oh, and this is my next place for you to take a guess in the chat. So there was a story about horse size. And it was that movies that are made of now current movies being made about the Middle Ages are really misleading about horse size. And so that led into how horses are measured by hands, which a hand is 4 inches across, used to be across your palm, including the thumb. And now it's been standardized to 4 inches. So if you were to take a guess in the chat of how many hands an average horse is, not the big Clydesdale, but just average horse. Horses are measured from the ground up to their shoulder. So if you were guessing how many hands for average, what would you say?
I saw 14 hands, which is also a good wine, says Teresa. So I appreciate
Hmm.
that. Natalie says 15. Christy is 18. Carol says 10. Christy says 12.
Okay.
We got 18, 10. So we've got a range from between 10 and 20.
And if I was having my class guess those, then I might write them down for them to see and ask them to figure out the mean and the mode and the median before we moved on to the answer. So you're pretty close. If we did the mean of the answers that you said, the average horse is 15.2 hands, but it's much bigger than it used to be. And in the Middle Ages, horses were really the size of ponies. And it was because they were faster and more agile, and they were used in battle, and they were easier to get around in. So anyway, movies that show big horses aren't like what it really was like. But that was a way to incorporate some news and then a little bit of culture and then the term hand and just all kinds of things into just maybe 2 or 3 minutes of our class. I've also learned that geography is where things are. Surprises me how much my class doesn't know where things are. And it first came to light when we were on environmental science and the topic of the Everglades came up, and not a single person in class, whether they were from the US or from somewhere else, knew where the Everglades were. So whenever I have a chance to put a map up of where something is and just building not only science context, but just cultural context, I do it. So you might remember in January, there was a volcano and we had studied volcanoes, and it was a really disruptive volcano in the South Pacific that almost buried the country that it hit or that it erupted in. And so a picture on the left of what it looked like a week before, and then what it looked like before the eruption, and then after it's just completely underwater from the ash of the volcano, which moved throughout the entire Pacific. Science news as a way to build vocabulary. So the word xeno, which means other, there was a recent transplant of a pig's heart into a human. And that's called the xenotransplant, of course, but it led us into talking about things like xenophobia, fear of other, fear of foreigner, and just the opportunity to build vocabulary, which not necessarily is it a science vocabulary word, but it makes science make more sense, and then it builds just a bigger vocabulary. Okay, next one, I was thinking of seeing if you would be willing to take a guess at this. So, and maybe you happen to see this in the news, but on the left is a picture of the International Space Station, and on the right is another map. And map is pointing at a spot in the South Pacific, but first even just identifying where in the world is that from the clues that you have on that globe. But the question I asked my class is, how do you think these two pictures might be connected? So if you have a thought or a guess on that, type that in the chat. And it can be a wild guess, or you might have seen the story and know.
Ooh, there's a guest saying that you're closer to the space station than you are to that spot in the bottom of the ocean.
That's a really good guess.
There is an idea of where maybe that's where that space equipment landed. There is a thing about taking photos at a revolution at that spot.
Oh my gosh, these are more sophisticated than the answers I got in class. Those are really good.
There's also some, is this where I come back to Earth if I was on the space station?
Uh-huh.
So there's
Okay.
lots of great things here.
Yeah, thank you for reading those. So the answer is that the space station will be up there for about 10 more years, but then that is the spot on Earth that is furthest away from any land, and it's considered an international space cemetery. So it's where the space station will eventually crash there and sink, and it will happen in 2031. And it goes back to the 1970s. Many countries bury their space equipment there. And I think right now it says 263 pieces. So making that prediction is a way of critical thinking, and I think a way of building cultural context and long-term memory. And it was kind of a fun thing to try. And I think I might have had a little link to a 1 or 2 minute news story about it as well that we watched. So that was science news. In March, there was this really misleading story about these spiders. So the first question I asked my class was how big they think this spider is and what they think about spiders. And it brought in some real fear of spiders, some cultural stories about spiders in other parts of the world. But this spider is about 4 inches big, and it has been found in the Southeast US, and it's poisonous. And the news story headlines were saying it's going to move into the Northeast this summer and people should watch out for it. Well, it turns out that it isn't really poisonous to humans because it's not capable of breaking human skin. And the question for my class to think about was, how did this spider get to the United States to begin with if it's coming from Southeast Asia? And let me see what time it is. Maybe if anyone has a guess at that, how did these yarrow spiders get into Georgia and Florida? I asked my class and they were guessing things like, someone said maybe it flew. So then opportunity to think about how a spider might actually move around.
People are saying some kind of transportation. So, like a
Yes.
ship or a freight container,
Yep.
boxes, fruit.
That's exactly it. It's on the shipping containers that came into the ports in the Southeast. And even if they do make their way, they do sort of fly by short distances by throwing their web out. And there is a chance they'll get to the Northeast, but it won't be very many. They won't be dangerous, and they won't be able to survive the cooler temperatures. So the headlines were misleading, but it was a good news story for all kinds of reasons. If there's ever a story that relates to a science news that I see that relates to a person that I'm teaching, I think that has had so much impact on our class in many ways. But I have a student from Burkina Faso who wants to get an advanced degree in science in the US, and he's taking the class to work on his English, which is his 3rd language. So I've learned so much about Burkina Faso from including things that he can incorporate into the class. And then this year's most prestigious architecture award was given to the first Black architect, but also an architect from Burkina Faso. And his style of architecture was environmentally sound architecture in places with extreme scarcity. So we looked at a bunch of pictures of why that was true, a bunch of things he had designed, and then how it related to what we had studied about the environment. This was a story about DNA. I'm going to ask this question for the chat too. So the story was that DNA, there's a new way to test people's DNA and to tell who people are related to, going back much further than anyone has ever been able to determine. It can go back now 800 years. So I asked my class, and I'm asking you for the chat, in your own family history, how many generations could you describe to us right now? Like who your parents are, who your grandparents are, and if you, without having to look up any documents, how far back could you go? How many generations?
3 seems like the most common response. Great grandparents.
Yeah. Parents, grandparents, great grandparents. That's like the same for me too. So this picture, the branches of the tree are all pictures of people. And the science is that they can go about 800 years now to tell pretty closely exactly where that DNA started out. And when I asked my class the same question, how far they can go, it's the same, 2 or 3. But one student said he could go 500 years because if he were to get married in his country, people would come, there would be a musical performance, and there would be a chant that would say who he was related to all the way back, and it would go back 500 years. So something culturally really interesting, not exactly science, but connecting the science to something that has meaning, and only took us 3 or 4 minutes at the beginning of class. Once in a while, the news story is I'll find something to listen to, which I think is a really good way of processing information. So there's a story about a rocket that was going to slam into the moon, and NPR had a 2-minute story. So we listened to it, and then I had everyone write on either their whiteboard or in the chat a sentence from it or an idea from it that stood out to them. So a different way to use news that's not text. Okay, I get a little carried away with my science news, but I think this might be the last one. So there's a story, so way to teach vocabulary, person who studies birds. And then you might remember in February that hundreds of birds dropped from the sky in Mexico. So showed the picture, asked my class to guess why. They came up with some pretty good guesses like chemistry, maybe something in the air, some kind of chemical, different environmental ideas. And the conclusion, and maybe you remember hearing this, but it related to so much of what we had studied a month before, that birds fly in these formats that start spinning, like in this picture, so that a predator bird gets confused and will just dive into the middle, but the swarm goes up and down, and the predator often misses, but this swarm dropped too low to the ground, and every bird at the bottom, they think, just fell out of the sky and then died on impact. So it was an interesting story, but also good predicting for them and related to what we've been studying. Studied the planets. So there's a story about Venus, and I asked what they remembered about Venus, and then we looked at what the new pictures of Venus are telling scientists.
So Susan, there's a question in the chat asking, when you're using these science news articles, you've mentioned you have students across lots of levels. How do you have them read the article? Do you summarize the article? How do you have them access that material?
Yeah, so well, it's a GED prep class, so their level is pretty high, but they come from all over the world, so their English level varies quite a bit. But I haven't yet used the text of the article, so it's either see it or listen to it or look at the picture, and it's just designed for a couple minutes of class. So discussion, talk about it, engage with it somehow. Then I just usually show them the bullet points. But that's a good question. Okay, my third idea, and is using the New York Times graphs, which I've mentioned a little bit already. I use these once a week on Thursday. And you may be familiar, but the New York Times puts out a graph for students of all kinds of levels, I think probably middle school and up, to analyze. And then they put out the graph and they have you think about it. And then a few days later, they reveal information and they put a bunch of links to it. So for example, here was one from, I don't know, sometime this winter, about how many million barrels of oil are being consumed. And so I put the graph up, and then I had students try to write a sentence that summarized what they were seeing. And then we compared their sentences. So it's fast, but it's, I think, effective. I had students look at this map of where the green spaces are the parts of the world that are getting more and more water, and the brown spaces are places that are having less and less water each year. And so I had them write an observation about change in precipitation on a world scale. And they wrote some really interesting things because they looked at the place that they came from for the most part. And there was a student from the part of India that's getting all the water, and she was able to tell us so much detail about why. And then I have a couple students from places that are going through drought, so they made interesting observations, but also a way to connect them and their culture. And then also a kind of map introduced, choropleth map, and a scientific concept that's important in studying science. So it tied everything together. Okay, this is one I'm going to see if you could guess again quickly. So this is a very different kind of graph about where people are coming and going. And I had my class guess the share of the US population that started somewhere else that are immigrants. And then after I got their guesses, I had them figure out the mean, mode, and median of those to stick in a little math. And then I showed them the answer. So one thing about this map, just as a side note, is I think lots of Americans assume that everyone in the world who's moving is coming to the US, and that's so far from true. And then we could talk about why the arrows were wider or skinnier and some conclusions like that. But if you were to put a guess in the chat, what you would guess percent of US population that was born in another country, what would you say?
I'm seeing 13%. I'm seeing 18%, 20%. Some people are thinking it's lower at 10%. Some people are thinking it could even be higher, like 50%.
Yeah, okay, so the range of guesses from my class was 13% up to one student thought 60%. And I think it depends where you live and where you come from, what you might guess, unless you happen to know the answer. So the answer for the US is 15%. A lot of your guesses were really close, and that's good critical thinking on your part. And when my class can do that, they're really pulling together lots of skills into making that guess. And then
Yeah, Susan, one of the things I wanted to jump in here, sorry for a second.
Yeah, go, no, go.
One of the participants said, I'm not sure from that first graph I have enough information to answer that question. And
Right.
sometimes that's a really great thing to noodle on too.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think you don't. So when you look at this, I'm not asking you to come up with the answer. I'm asking you to take a guess from your own experience and see how close you can come. Yeah, that's a good point. And another kind of map here, choropleth, where it's high in the world, where it's low, where people are not going to. And then here is the really interesting, when Americans are asked what percent of the average American answer is 37%, but the reality is 13 to 15%, the share who are actually immigrants. So, and then it compares that to other places of the world, what people said, and then what the actual answer is. So just a way of using the graph. This one was how weddings plummeted during COVID, impact on economy, and that led me down this rabbit hole about fertility rate over the last 100 years. So I stuck in my own graph I pulled up from the census about that, and then a map about fertility rates. And it led to, in my class, it wasn't a aggressive argument, but it was a dispute over why there are parts of the world where people are still having so many children. And one person said it was religion, and another person said it is not religion at all. It is men want to have boys and they can have 6 girls or 7 girls. And if they don't get a boy, they will still have more and more children. And then someone hit upon agricultural economy. So it was social studies coming into science, but also all the science of charts and graphs. I'm just going to skip over this couple of these, but they'll be in the slides and you can take a look or come back to them later. Okay, so now my idea of using these whiteboards. So I really believe that if you draw things out, if you diagram them, even last night studying some things about momentum, we had a problem about the skateboarder, and I asked students to get their whiteboard and listen to the text of the problem as I read it, but draw out what they were hearing before we even looked at the question. It seems to be successful. So in symbiotic relationships, I had them pick one and try to draw an example of one of these terms and then hold up their whiteboard, and we would see if we could figure out which term it was. So like a bee and a flower have a mutual relationship where they both benefit. And I can remember one of the students in the class, and it's hard to get pictures of it because they turn out kind of blurry, but she had a snake and then had taken a mouse, and it was just really effective. And some people can draw, and then other people, I just diagram things, but I get to the heart of it. Writing a sentence on their whiteboard that uses terms, and then holding up or reading their sentences. Contests sometimes where they keep track. So I might make true or false questions and have them put a T and an F on the whiteboard, and then just put their marker down, make a little tally mark, and keep track of the number they get. And like an example, if your chat is easily accessible and you want to put in T or F into the chat, a light year is equivalent to 1 year in Earth time. If you would say that's true or false. And of course, in this case, they were reviewing and you would have enough information to answer. And the answer is false. A light year is 6 trillion miles. Another example from that particular contest was an ocean has been discovered on Jupiter, and that is false. It's on Saturn. The red spot on Jupiter, I learned in teaching this class, is a hurricane. That's a 300-year-old hurricane, but there's nothing stopping it, so it keeps moving. Sometimes using the whiteboards to draw out diagrams. So this problem had an example of a cactus, how we pull back, or a chocolate cake, we might eat it because our brain, it looks good. So I asked them to pick something else besides cactus or chocolate cake and see if they could diagram out what would happen. And they did really well. And they picked things like touching a hot stove or touching a fire. I think those were the 2 most common. This one I did try to take pictures of what they did. So on biology, and watched a video about how cells are put together twice. So the first time just watched it, The second time they could make any notes about it and draw any part of it they wanted. Then we took the whiteboards and they tried to draw the parts of a cell. And while they were drawing it, I left the potential vocabulary that you could use some of, or whichever parts you could remember. And then here's a couple examples that I took, as blurry as they are, but they're pretty good. And if they hold them up and it's not me trying to take a picture with my phone, I could see what they drew. And some people can really draw. And
So
then
Susan, just to clarify, you're
Yeah.
doing this virtually. Your students aren't in the room
Yeah,
with you, right?
right. Yeah, everything. I haven't met any of them in person except at testing nights, a couple. So it's been a real experiment to me. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. This is the same as true false, except this time it was with AB, elements that comprise the sun, and then picking between two answers, and then drawing out the solar system. But we had studied it for a couple of weeks and I got so interested in it that I spent longer than I intended having them do things with it. And I was so impressed with how much they could draw out. But it didn't take long, giving them 5 to 7 minutes and the markers and then just hold up, so much more engaging than other things I might have thought of doing. I'm writing sometimes a sentence on the whiteboard, so carrying capacity, and then writing a generalization about carrying capacity. This is a really crazy story about the US government leaving reindeer for soldiers, and they never needed them during World War II. They took the soldiers away. When the war ended, they left the reindeer, and the reindeer population skyrocketed and then plummeted. And so this is just a good example.
So
Okay.
as you're moving on, Susan, you have
Yeah.
about 7 minutes left of your
Okay.
session today.
So I can quickly go through the distance learning. So our virtual students are required to come to class twice a week and then to do 2 hours of distance learning each week. And I use Common Lit, and it's very easy to find good science in Common Lit, but I don't like them to do that out on an island. So I try to incorporate all of it into class. So for example, a Common Lit about the UN and plastic pollution, or a Common Lit about farming in space, and then a discussion in class. So I might put this slide up at the beginning of class the day it was due, which is every Tuesday. And then I might call in a person and let them pick any one of the questions. And sometimes the questions are, did you process what you read? But sometimes they're, what do you think? And what do you predict? What meaning does this have? Sometimes it's, we read about how vaccines work. And so writing or drawing out the meaning of one of the terms on their whiteboard. Or, oh my gosh, something about the sun and telling time that we read. And I started thinking about how I'm so crazy about time. And I would describe time as 7:03. I would never say about 7. And so I asked them when they grew up how important was time, and the stories about using the sun to tell time, using a hole in the house in Guatemala where the sun would come through every day and where it was shining was how they knew what time it was. Being up in the mountains kinds of examples, and how they also, many of my students think Americans' concept of time is just so different to anything that they were used to. So it was an accidental. And I pulled up a couple pictures of the places that they came from where the sun seemed important and asked them if this looked like, and then was just a good discussion from Common Lit. And then, okay, finally, I see I have 5 minutes. So math, I keep a little list of everything that's on the science test that's also math, and I try to put a little bit of it into each class. So I listened to a really cool podcast called What Happened To, and the podcast during the time of the Olympics was what happened to the Jamaican bobsled team. And if you like podcasts, I highly recommend it, because the fact that Jamaica had a bobsled team is not an anomaly. It should. And because track athletes are the best at bobsled, and they had a really good bobsled team again this year in the Olympics. So I got distracted by that, but then I used the Olympics to make up math problems. So I had a chart of the medal winners and a probability question about the data of the top countries that won medals. I don't know if you're teaching virtually, if you have this happen, but people's pets come across the screen a lot, and we always have cats. So I made up a probability problem about, or I think this is a permutation problem, well, randomly select. So a problem about a probability about cats, but it just was kind of fun to do because we talk about these cats so much. And then a permutation about cats as well. And then more recently, I think this was just within the last 2 weeks, a story about powerful passports that let you in places without visas and show the perception the rest of the world has. So I took the top 10 powerful passports and just talking about how the US is barely in the top quarter. It's 41st out of a score of 105 is its score, and there are almost 200 countries in the world, so it's not so powerful. But then we use that to figure out mean mode range, and we used it to, I think I had a bunch of others about probability. So those, I know that's just rapid fire of 45 minutes of ideas. And so I'm sorry it was not as engaging as some of the other sessions I've been to, but I hope everybody could pick up at least one little seed of an idea that you might be able to adapt and use either in person or virtually, science or reading or social studies, or really any subject, I hope. So with a couple minutes left, are there any questions?
And I do want to remind people again, go back to this in the participant folder to the PDF of the slides. Then you can spend some time with it and even pull one or two. I'm just gobsmacked is what I would say, because it's just the amount of curiosity you can pique. It's just enormous.
Thank you.
Make sure that you look at the chat to see the wonderful comments people are making.
Oh yeah, okay, I could just pull it up now that I don't need any slides. Thank you so much.
Yes, people are really excited about it. There was lots of great ideas. It was people are saying this was very engaging. Some people even said it was their favorite session of the day. So and I just want to let you know that Susan is new to ABE. And so I want to kind of just really encourage you that as you're getting started and as you're doing things, they're so great to be able to see how you can pull in your expertise. I agree with everybody in the chat. This was really great. I appreciate you showing us the actual screens you're using with your students.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Instead of trying to make it like super presentery, we got to actually see what you did, and that's fantastic.
That's the only way I can keep myself organized. So now I sort of have the template in my mind, do the news, do some GED practice, do this, and then I plug it all in. But I can't teach without a slideshow.
Well, science, we haven't done enough science. I know people are happy to see science. I can say too, this was my favorite session of the day, and I actually did my own session and I liked this better. So Susan, wow. It was great. And you got about the best compliment you can get. This was awesome. I wish it was longer.
Oh, thank you so much.
Take that with you. That is amazing. And one thing I want to tell everyone as you're still wonderful, kudos for Susan, is I'm putting a link in the box. Do not forget to do an evaluation for this conference. You can find the link on your flyer. The link is also here. That is the way to get your CEUs. And so you will get your CEUs after you fill out the evaluation. We appreciate those evaluations. And yes, on behalf of Atlas, I am going to tell you all, we will be seeing Susan more.
Yeah.
I promise.
There's a direct request for information about how to cover climate change. And there's a lot of great ways to do climate change with science and social studies and ELA. There's a lot of, and math. Obviously math is my baby. So it is 3 o'clock. I really appreciate everybody hanging out with us until the end of the day on a Friday. Please fill out that eval. If you have anything that you want some follow-up information from Susan, Susan is really, really great to communicate with. So she has her email there. Please feel free to use it. On behalf of me and Christine, and I hope, Susan, we were super happy to hang out with you today.
Yeah, that was so much fun. Thank you.
Yes, this was wonderful and a great, thank you for participating in the chat, everybody. That was fantastic. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Otherwise, we will see you soon. If you are thinking about, maybe I could do something like this, put in a presentation proposal for Summer Institute, because they would be great. We'd love to see more science sessions. So thank you, everybody. And I hope you have a wonderful weekend.